Yo, what's cracking everybody? So in today's video, I'm going to be teaching you how to improve your bass lines. The three types of bass lines I'm going to be going over are 808s, synth sub basses, and funk style basses using a bass guitar. So as you can see, I got a nice little beat loaded up right here, and this is not my usual style of beat, but it's just something real quick that I threw together in order to demonstrate bass lines for you guys. So this beat is very simple, as you can see. It's just two instruments and a couple of drum sounds. And because of this beat's simplicity, the genre is not yet clearly defined. We can take this beat in a whole lot of different directions, and what direction we take it is going to be largely dependent on the bass line that we choose. So the first type of bass line I'm going to start with is the 808. Mainly because this is probably the most common bass line that you see in music nowadays. So the very first rule of thumb whenever you're making a bass line is you want to be following the root note of the chord progression. Or you could also follow the bass note of the chord progression. And although you may think those are the same thing, they're not. They're very different from one another. So if we take a look at the chord progression that I have written right here for this beat, you can see that it is a 1, 5, 4, 2, 7 progression. And the 7th scale degree is altered to make it a major 7th. So for example, with this 5 chord, you may look at this and think the root note is C sharp because it's the bottom note of the chord. But unfortunately, you would be mistaken. The root note is actually A. And that's because this is an inversion. If I highlight these two notes and move them up an octave using Control up key, you can see it's an A major chord. But since these top two notes are moved down an octave, this chord is in the first inversion. So moving back over to the bass line, if you were to write the bass line using the root note, the pattern would go from D in the first bar to A in the second bar. If you were to use the bass note, it would go from D in the first bar to C sharp in the second bar. So a lot of the time the root note is the bass note if you're building simple root position chords, but if you're using inversions, the bass note and the root are different. Either way though, if you build the bass line based off of either the bass note or the root note, generally you will have a good sounding bass pattern. The next thing you want to do when building your bass line is you want to match the 808 hits up to the kick. So you can see this is the pattern that the kick drum is playing, so ideally we want the 808 to hit every time the kick plays. So there we go, I just wrote in a quick little bass line, and you can see I matched the 808 up to the kick pattern almost perfectly. The only note I left out was this little kick right here. There's no 808 matching up with that. And as for the notes being played, I just chose to follow the bass note. I didn't follow the root, because like I said before, this 5 chord and this 4 chord are not in root position. I just followed the bass note. So this goes from D to C sharp to D to E, back to C sharp, and then it repeats. So you know, that would work. If you're going for a simple beat, this works just fine. But it's a wee bit boring, isn't it? Let's be honest here, this isn't a very interesting bass line. So there's a couple little tricks you can use to spice this up a bit. So right here, since I have two 808s being played right next to each other very quickly, I'm gonna take the first one and I'm gonna hit Control up key to move it up an octave. And then for the second half of this bar, rather than having these two 808 hits play the bass note, I'm gonna move them up to the root note, which is A. Then right here in the third bar, I'm gonna do the same thing. Rather than having it play a D, which is the bass note, I'm gonna have it play a G, which is the root note. So just like that, adding variation in which notes are being played immediately makes the pattern more interesting. Now, one little thing I want to add in this third bar is a slide. So this first 808, which is a G, I want it to slide into this D that we see later in the bar. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to put another G right here on top of the D. Then I'm going to double click the bottom 808, which is the one I want it to slide to, and I'm going to hit this button right here. Hit accept. So now when this 808 plays on the root note, it's gonna slide down to the bass note. And now I wanna kinda make it bounce right back up to the root because I think that would sound cool. So I'm gonna click on this slide note, and when you click on a slide note, the next note you make will also be a slide note. And I'm gonna put the second slide note right here next to the original G, so that way it's gonna slide down to the D and then slide back up to the G. So right there, I think that's a super dope effect. I don't know about you. And so with those tips right there, you can make a pretty solid 808 pattern. Alright, so now the next type of bass line we're going to be looking at is the synth bass. Now me personally, when I make my music, I don't follow trends whatsoever, alright? I have absolutely no freaking idea what the popular sounds are in the music industry right now. I have no clue. I don't know what drum sounds are hot. I don't know what hi-hat patterns are hot. I don't know what bass sounds are hot. I don't know none of that, alright? I make my music based off what I think sounds good. So if I want to throw in a synth bass rather than an 808, I'm gonna do it and no one's stopping me. And I think that you guys should too, alright? We need more variation in the music we're making. We need to switch things up around here, you know what I'm saying? So you can find some solid synth bass presets in almost any plugin. There's tons of free plugins that have good synth bass presets. I mean shit, there's a lot of native plugins in FL Studio that have good synth bass presets. However, I personally own Serum, so I like to go in and mess with these wavetables, move them down a couple of octaves, and make my own sound. So this is the bass sound that I made real quick. Pretty simple, pretty growly. It's bassy, you know what I'm saying? It works, it gets the job done. And the rules for when you're making a synth bass are pretty much the same as an 808, but generally you want them to be a little bit less complex. So you can hear that bass line is a lot more simple than the 808. And if you really wanted to, of course, you could use an 808 sample to make a pattern this simple. That's the beauty of music, you know, it's all up to your interpretation. Moving on, we got the last type of bass line, and this is gonna be a funk bass. So normally what I would do if I was making this kind of bass line is I would plug in my cheap ass little $40 audio interface. I would take my normal guitar, I would play in a bass line and pitch it down an octave because I'm too broke to afford a bass guitar. However, not only am I too broke to afford a bass guitar, but my guitar cable, my only guitar cable, also broke and I'm waiting for a new one to ship in. So unfortunately for today's video, the whole idea of recording in guitar is simply off the table. So of course, the next best thing would be going to your list of VST plugins and opening up Labs, which is a plugin you should all have. If you don't, you're sleeping, and then you should head down to the bass guitar presets. My favorite one is probably this one called Warm Bass DI. So there we go, I just wrote in a nice little bass pattern using this bass preset, and you can tell right off the bat it's a lot more complex than the previous bass lines, isn't it? We got notes going all over the place. We got hella notes, like look at them, there's so many. And that's because when you're making a bass line with a bass guitar, generally there's a lot more room to play around. And what I mean by that is you don't really have to be as strict with following the root in the bass notes as you do with an 808 or a synth bass. With those bass lines, it's such a powerful, heavy-hitting sound that you really want it emphasizing the bass of your chord progression. Whereas with something on a bass guitar, you know, you can kind of mess around and throw in some extra funky notes, and that's what makes it sound so unique. You can hear, I'm not following the root notes, I'm not following the bass notes, I'm not even following the kick progression. I'm breaking every single rule I laid out for you guys throughout the entire video. But that's just what you can do when you're using a bass guitar, and that's what makes it sound so funky and so cool, in my opinion. I am a strong advocate for using bass guitar in rap and pop music. It's fire, just try it out. The only downside with using it is you do need to have a little bit of experience. There isn't as much of a hard rule set you can follow to guarantee the bass line sounds good like how there is with an 808 or a synth bass. I mean, yeah, if you wanted to, you could follow the rules and just play root notes with a bass guitar, but where's the fun in that? You gotta have a little bit of an ear for music. You gotta be able to listen to the bass line and really feel the groove, you know what I'm saying? Either way though, I've been rambling for long enough. That pretty much covers the entire video. Those are the general steps and guidelines you can use to make sure that your bass lines are sounding clean. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you can use these tips in your own music. Leave a like if you would like, and I will catch you next time, foo.